And we're really thrilled to have this program. It's always special to have a Pulitzer Prize winner speak to us here, but it's actually just that much more special when it's an actual member of the library, so we're really thrilled. Gregory Pardlo's first collection of poetry, Totem, was selected by Brenda Hillman for the American Poetry Review's Honickman First Book Prize in 2007. His second collection, Digest, won the 2015 Pulitzer Prize. So how's that for progress? He has received a fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. He's the poetry editor of the Virginia Quarterly Review and currently teaches in the graduate writing program at Rutgers University. His latest book, the book he will be talking about tonight, the memoir Air Traffic, was released in April of this year and was named to a whole lot of books to read lists, including New Jersey Monthly's 10 books to read this summer, the New York Times' 17 refreshing books to read this summer, the BBC's 10 books to read in April, and Vogue's 10 most anticipated books of spring. The book received a starred review in Booklist, and it's been launched by the New York Post, the New York Times, the Washington Post, a little mashup there.
I don't think the New York Post.
I'm just going to read a few of the wonderful things that have been written about it. Separate observations, anecdotes, and arguments strung together in a magnificent and deeply affecting whole. Prose that seems powerful and effortless, a masterwork, and my favorite, an excellent contender in the Great American Memoir category. So we're very happy to have Gregory Pardlo for today. And we are also really excited to have Lisa Lucas with us. Lisa Lucas is the executive director of the National Book Foundation, which is, as you all know, presents the National Book Awards. And you must be super busy since they will be announced in just another week or 2 weeks. Yeah, we're all anxiously awaiting that. Prior to joining the foundation, she served as a publisher of Guernica magazine, which is a terrific online magazine that focuses on writing that explores the intersection of art and politics, and for which we have also had a really great collaboration with, and we're having another program with them actually in December, which is going to be fun. She has also served as Director of Education at the Tribeca Film Institute, on the development team at Steppenwolf Theater Company, and as a consultant for the Sundance Institute, San Francisco Film Society, the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards, and RealWorks Teen Filmmaking. I think my favorite thing that has been written about her was by the LA Times, which said that Lisa Lucas is a high-energy, bookish extrovert. So thank you both for being here.
So now I'm going to fail you all by being really introverted and awkward.
No, at all.
So I'm going to force Greg to read a little bit, which he was very sad about when I told him. But first, I'd like to ask a little bit about how you describe the book, because I feel like it's one thing. You sit in your house or where you write and you come up with these ideas about how you're going to tell some kind of story, right? And then it goes into the world and people write about it and all the reviews and you're on this list and it turns into this whole other thing. Yeah. People start describing to you the thing that is so fundamental to the person that you are, especially when it's a memoir or essays or something personal. Like, how do you like to describe the book?
So first, I want to thank you for coming out and having this conversation with me. I admire Lisa immensely. She is an incredible reader and absolutely high energy extrovert. I think is definitely appropriate. And we discovered not too long ago that we are in all likelihood related. And we have to be because she was reading the book and she came across the name Parham. My mother's father's family was Parham, and she has Parham lineage, and we're like,
from the same place too.
Virginia? Parham's from Virginia. It's very unlikely that we're not related in some way. So it was a very special coincidence. And she insists on carrying around this very raggedy old galley of version of
I have a hardcover copy at home that I don't want to put in my purse and have it get all bendy. So the galleys are great because you're just they're gross and they can become
Actually, it's interesting you have this, it takes me back. I was thinking how much of this book was actually written in this building. And just about all of it was written in this building. I remember, in fact, when I became a member, one of the reasons I did was because I was planning on spending a lot of time in the writer's room working on the manuscript for this. I didn't know what it was going to be when I started. Well, that's not true. I guess I imagined a kind of conventional memoir that was linear. You know, I was born, I became an adolescent, a wacky adolescent, I screwed up, I got better, you know, and as I thought about that narrative, I got more and more, not frustrated, but less excited about that narrative. I mean, it's a story that we all know, and it's become all too predictable. And so I kept thinking about different ways to enter into the story and to think about the story, and finally got to the point where I decided, well, I'll get another degree. I'll go to Columbia and enroll in the MFA program in nonfiction, and that'll help me fix it. It was a little more work than I anticipated, but it worked out. And the book then evolved what was a kind of very bad linear attempt at telling my life story, biography. I then started to cherry pick pieces of it that seemed most interesting to me, that I was most excited about, and then developing those into essays. And at that point, I really didn't think about the book being a memoir or even being reflective of my life in any particular way. I was intent on writing standalone essays that were thinking about issues that only happened to be worked through the lens of my memory and experience. The book gets sold. The editors at Knopf look at the essays and they say, well, if we rearrange it this way, it looks more like a memoir. Okay. And so we rearranged the essays so that it looks more like a memoir. And then, well, if we kind of stitch together the essays so that they speak more, more linearly to one another, it works better as memoir. So they kind of steered the streamliner back to being as much as it could, back to the kind of conventional understanding of a linear life story.
So, do you feel like it is what you wanted to do? Like, does it feel sort of like, I mean, writing is this lifelong process, right? So it's like, I always assume that every writer is like on to the next thing the minute you've done a thing. So it's not like a criticism when I ask, like, do you feel like it did the thing you wanted it to do? It's more.
No, it doesn't, but no book does, actually. So and I enter into each project with this idealistic vision. This is going to be the one that's going to say what I want to say. It's going to speak deeply from my core. And it's such even the poetry collections are such a production that after a while it just becomes its own thing. And I guess that's good in some sense. But no, I don't have the feeling that, I don't know, my answer will probably change when at different times when you ask me, but my sense right now is that there are a number of places where I'm like, I know the story that fits in between there. At some point, I'm going to need to tell that story.
Right, because it's a continuation,
exactly.
Like, especially when you're talking about your own truth. So, like, to that point, like, right, you're writing about your family, you're writing about your own life, you're writing from memory, right? You're writing about memories that other people share. How, like, do you feel like you got down to the truth? That, like, your truth? Do you feel like, and then my second question will be about reception.
Yeah, so what I discovered so this being my obviously first work of nonfiction,
Mm-hmm.
I discovered that the truth is really shifty when we're talking about memories, right? And when there's no documentation for anybody's memory over 20, 30 years, it can be really contentious.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to kind of think about it as a good faith effort, right? What I feel to be the truth, and to sort of bake into the process an admission that I don't know what actually was the case, but this is my necessarily biased sort of take on that period, that moment. But you're asking about,
Sure, so your family plays,
Right.
like, looms very large.
Right.
So, like, who was the first family member to read it?
Perhaps at least the only family member that's said anything to me so far.
It's all about them. Wow.
Yeah, I don't know, it's my mom. So in the last essay / chapter, intervention. So the essay is called On Intervention because my family was on A&E's Intervention, a television show. My brother was
Do you know what intervention is?
No.
Okay, so, well, I have to actually go back even further to set up what the show was. My brother was in an R&B, a very popular R&B group around the turn of the century called City High. And this group, they were the Grammy-nominated group, and they even opened the MTV Video Music Awards at Lincoln Center one year, and they traveled the world, and he made an awful lot of money and did awful lot of drugs and drank an awful lot, to the point where, he was very young, and he was alcoholic, a raging alcoholic, and no one wanted to work with him at some point. And so the group fell apart, and my mother was a consummate stage mom. Right? She was invested in Robbie's success, for I guess good reasons as well as perhaps selfish reasons. And she tried to get him into various rehabs, and as we know, these things can be really expensive. And Robbie didn't have the patience for a 12-step program, right, which I had been recommending all along. So what she did then was she wrote a letter to the cable television station, A&E, that has this show called Intervention, where they will follow someone who is suffering from addiction or alcoholism for several weeks, filming them in all of their depravity, and then film the family members, give some background on the family members, and then the family members come together and stage an intervention. And it's a very dramatic affair. Of course, the big moment that the story builds up to is, will you accept this promise of a healthy life by going to the rehab? They pay for it, the A&E pays for this really expensive Malibu rehab. And so this was my mother's solution, was to get him on a globally syndicated.
I'm just still stuck on, I know you'll let you finish the story, but I'm still stuck on, you all went on intervention, but nobody has said anything about the book except your mom. That's like where I'm stuck. So we just carry on.
The surviving people are me, my mother, Robbie, my brother, his wife, and my aunt Donna. Those are the members of my family. There were two other friends of his that were on the show, on the show. I'm sure Robbie's wife didn't read it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not so certain that my brother read it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my Aunt Donna flipped through to find where her name was, and read which is fine. I can't blame her. So we were on this television show, Intervention, and I'm confronted with the idea of rehabilitating. I'm thinking through the idea of rehabilitating somebody as rescuing them from their own addiction in front of a global audience, right? So that's simultaneously rehabilitating his career and trying to parse, well, what are the ethics of this? From a maternal perspective, and ultimately the question I'm asking too is, very deep in there is, did my mother love me? Right? Or to what extent did my mother love me? And to what extent am I a prop for her, sort of, self-celebration? And I don't think there's great harm in either direction, but it just strikes me as a really, maybe I am invested in the answer somehow. I would like to say it's a purely intellectual exercise, but okay, no, I think I probably care a little bit more than I want to admit.
Well, as a reader, right? Like you're like as a reader, as not you, right? Like not the person who's telling the story, or even just sort of like paying mostly attention to kind of some of the more exciting parts of your story. You are interrogating like the way that your mother loves you, if your mother loves you, the way your father loves you, if your father loves you, the competition between. So I'm imagining you sitting in this building, like going through all of these relationships. I mean, like, was it hard work? Like the writing, right? Like from my perspective, seems like easy work for you, right? You tell stories really well. Like listening to you talk, you have like such a facility with words from a poet, right? Like, but the actual sentiment behind it seems like it must have been different work and hard work to get at, because you're sort of really laying yourself bare in a lot of ways.
Well, it's interesting, as you're saying this, I'm reminded of one of the challenges I found myself confronting. Oh, that's my wife. That's Ginger. She's in the book too, by the way.
You got here right before we got to that part.
Just in time. So one of the things that I did find myself confronting over and over again is I'm talking about my mother and questioning her motives in her investment in rehabilitating her son. As I'm writing this, one of the goals of writing personal essay and memoir is to get at the truth, right? Is to dig deep and find the unadorned, honest truth. But it's also work of artifice. I mean, it's also got, Knopf stamped on it, and there's, a nice little package for sale, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm making this art object at the same time as, So I found myself kind of wrestling with how much of the character, Greg Jr., that I created in the book was necessarily a work of artifice meant to carry the story that I'm telling through that character, versus how much of it, and I guess this goes back to your original question, how much do I feel revealed in the book. So yeah, I was constantly negotiating to what extent I was striking the nerves of my own insecurities, my own, true impulses, versus jazzing it up a bit and then, being poetic.
So even with the interview, with the subtitle is Memoir of Ambition and Manhood in America, right? So it's like, so I feel like, like you don't read read books by dudes about being a dude, right? Where it's like, does my mother love me? Right, like that's not a thing. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, it's happened, I'm sure, but it's not like.
It's not a thing.
It's not a thing. You know, but it is a thing here, right? Like you're just really, you know, maybe it is your poet heart, you know, but it's like, but this is really, you know, I was really struck by, you know, some of the, like, the exposure. You know, and not just exposure of like we were on, I mean the exposure happened when we were on the show, right? Like, but the exposure of family history, you're talking about addiction, or talking about what have you, but really the willingness to sort of get at stuff that's really complicated. I mean, you're talking about sort of raw emotion and manhood in America and race, you know, as like a, which is not in the title, but there's, you know, there's two brown, you know, male characters.
That was very, we can talk about that. That was very intentional.
So, I mean, I guess just, you know, when you're thinking about writing about manhood, like what was the take that you took using your own life? What were you trying to say about manhood in America?
Well, fortunately, that subtitle didn't come around until after I had written the book, and we were kind of sitting around talking, you know, with the editors, trying to figure out what are the kind of major through lines. But in the process of writing it, I was very much thinking about so two things. The book is written pre-November 2016. It's written pre-Me Too. And so and looking at it, reading it now, I don't know if there's a fortunate naivete. I don't know if I benefit from not knowing what was coming, right? And to what extent. But I was thinking about patriarchy and toxic masculinity without the backdrop. I guess it is fortunate, without the backdrop of the bombshell of, of the movement. So I kind of had the freedom I felt at least I had the freedom to be revealing in a way that wasn't as self-conscious as I certainly would be if I was writing.
Like, what do you think would have come out if you had had to write it?
I wouldn't have. I don't think I could have been as open about. So there's one of the videos, music videos that my brother's group made was. The start of it is the three of them are sitting around and they're saying, oh, so-and-so is a hoe. Why is she she's the woman is an exotic dancer, and this is how she makes money for it. It's very cliche. I mean, it's pop music, right? And this is how she makes money to raise her child. She's a single mom, yada yada. And in the video, they show these two women dancing, and the men are throwing money at them, and it's really, really offensive, as music videos tend to be. And I'm thinking through the misogyny that's baked into that entire scene, and I'm thinking through the misogyny that comes from my father, that is baked into both my brother and me, and the kinds of assumptions that we made around a scene like this, that would make a scene like this, and the very condescending response to it that's in the song, which is, stop doing that, that's shameful, my mother raised me without having to dance, you should be able to do it too, right? When the response could have been, let me help you buy groceries, let me babysit for you, or right, let's bring the kid, right? There are other ways that shaming wasn't the only kind of response that one could make. But in the context of the video, in context of the song, it did not occur to, I'm sure it did not occur to my brother that there was another way to approach it that did not rely on latent misogyny, sexism. And so I'm thinking about how, as an American male, I mean, race, class, regardless, as an American male, as a Western male, it's in there. as enlightened as I want to be, as progressive as I think I am, as sensitive as I am. My father often criticized me for being a sensitive poet. He did not use those kind words.
They didn't mean to say poet her.
Yeah, no.
Love it.
I know you did. No matter what my self-image is, right? I know that it's an inescapable part of our culture.
Right.
And so what I wanted to do was to kind of use myself and my family as a test subject for the kind of reflection that I would like to see in the world.
Yeah. And so through the lens, right, also like that's it's a memoir of ambition and manhood in America, but like there's a black boy and a black man on the cover, and like what does that then do to the narrative and what it's meant to do and what you're trying to interrogate?
I was pretty shocked actually when they sent me the mock-ups of the cover. Well, to see my picture and my father's picture on the cover. But I don't know when's the last time we've seen a cover with a black father and son that wasn't talking about, some kind of pathology.
Right.
Right. And, he's not dressed as a thug or, right, there's no, there are no suggestions of, sort of, what we anticipate, the kinds of, as I say, social pathologies, ills that surround black males. None of that is suggested here. And so I was kind of challenged, well, what is this cover saying? And frankly, I wondered how comfortable would people be holding a book with a black man and his son on the cover.
And how did it turn out?
I haven't seen it on the subway.
Actually,
yeah. It's funny because
I was very excited. I attacked the person.
You just.
I know him really well.
So of course I know this color, right? And I saw the book without the cover.
Ah.
I don't know if that had anything to do with it. And I'm sure I'm saying more about my own kind of subconsciousness than anything societal. But we talked a lot about whether or not to put the word race on the cover. And I want, it's kind of the conversation that folks are having. Tayari Jones's book, An American Marriage. It was an Oprah book. It was really, yeah. And there was some very low-level debate about, because the book is about an African American husband and wife. Some low-level debate about whether or not the book should have been called a black marriage, an African American marriage. You didn't catch this; it was on Twitter too. An African American. So someone suggested this should have been called an African American marriage, and the Twitter sphere explodes, and people and we don't need Tayari to know that it was very much part of the thinking not to call it an African American marriage, right? Because we're highlighting the fact that an African American marriage is an American marriage, and right, and how this is, sort of representative of broad experience.
Right.
So that kind of thinking went into the decision not to put race in the subtitle, and particularly when the picture is what it is.
Yeah. And the book subverts sort of the standard narrative of like an African American life in a lot of different ways. Like one, in the essay, you're sort of talking a lot about race, you're talking a lot about sexuality, you're dealing with stuff that's like, there's one moment that's about intimate moments and interracial relationships, right? That's like not a thing that you usually read
Not
about.
something,
Right,
yeah.
this is your family, you know, your dad was an air traffic controller, you know, you guys were firmly middle class, you're growing up in New Jersey, you're not in a city or an urban setting, you're not dealing with like the same kind of sort of economic pressures that you often hear about, but like, you know, so is that a driver for you telling this story? Is that like, you know, is that like part of why you, I'm curious, like, so this is like a messy question, sometimes I ask
Go
all
for it,
messy
yeah.
questions, but I guess I'm interested in sort of like why we decided to tell our stories, and I guess the second part of the question is like, is it that your story is a non-traditional, or a non-traditional to the way that we think, the stereotypical traditional story? Is that like a reason to tell the story?
Yeah, I think one of my motives, one of the things I'm responding to is, you know, having grown up in mostly white environments in my education,
Mm-hmm.
I've often dealt with the exceptionalizing narrative, the "oh, you're different" narrative, right? And I have always responded to it as there's nothing different at all about me. What's different are the expectations that we place on people. And you know, as I was thinking about the expected narratives of recovery, I was also thinking, so my grandfather, my mother's father, was one of the first African Americans hired by the FAA he wasn't called an engineer. They wouldn't allow to be called an engineer at the time. This is the 40s. But that's what he was. And as I'm trying to tell this story, which is a stair step to my father's story, I hear it starting to fall into the pattern of the first black person to do X, right? This exceptional figure that is, you know, in essence, better than, and you know, the Jackie Robinson story, able to overcome great odds, and you know, my grandfather was just a guy looking for a job, and he suffered a whole lot of crap, but he did it because he enjoyed what he was doing, and you know, he was in it for the payoff of the work. He wasn't looking to, you know, to break barriers. And I think there's when we talk about the black middle class, we're talking about an entire range of stories of people just doing, you know, just doing their lives, just living their lives, right? When we tend to romanticize them as these exceptional figures, and what that does, of course, is it reinforces the stories that we tell about people who aren't in the black middle class,
Mm-hmm.
right? And allows us to justify, oh, they're not they're not working hard, and you know, they are where they are because they failed to do something.
Right. No, the flip side, right? Like one of the things you don't, like you hear a lot about like addiction stories, and you hear about sort of, but you don't hear, like particularly in the black middle class, but like just when we talk about black addiction, we don't think about the lineage of that addiction and how it's multi-generational. It's always like symptomatic of, you know, environment, and oh, you lived in this horrible neighborhood and your life was so hard and you became a crackhead, like, do you know what I mean? When, but it's like this story really looks at multiple generations of addiction, you know, and so, I mean, I don't know if that's me, but.
Yeah, so that was another discovery. I mean, I learned so much in the process of writing the book. In interviewing my grandfather, obviously before he passed in 2014, while interviewing him, he told me about how, you know, the nightclub he worked in, where he's quote unquote learned how to drink, and I'm, you know, thinking about, again, a very human experience of this young man being, you know, he's from Philadelphia, he's in Oklahoma City, training at the FAA Academy, where he's not allowed to sleep in the dorms, so he's living in a house of ill repute, which was the only place that would rent him a room in Oklahoma City. And and on the side, he has to get this part-time job working in a segregated nightclub, meaning a black nightclub. And the sheriff of Oklahoma City goes to this nightclub, which is segregated, right? He and his deputies, so the other police on the force, come to this black nightclub on the outskirts of Oklahoma City and Oklahoma is dry, it's a dry state. And so they're there drinking. So my grandfather, again, young man, very far from home, is serving the sheriff alcohol, the sheriff and his deputies and their wives, alcohol in. So the levels of protocol that he had to learn very quickly, right? And how this society operates. And I imagine it would be a little stressful.
Yeah. A little bit, you think? You know, and then I swear I'm gonna make you read this page because I really want to hear you read a bit of it. But I have one more question about sort of like black exceptionalism. Like, right? So it's like actually like obviously we're cousins. But like my family is like really similar, but I feel like, you know, you have these people who are just doing like relatively ordinary things, but they've slipped through the system and they're, you know, like they end up like with a great teaching job, or they like somehow end up getting their PhD in education, like, but like it drives people like, in that time, like in the 40s. They end up the executive director. You know, but they end up like, it was like, I feel like if I were to ever write a story, like a memoir, it would be like about like, you know, like excelling in the 40s and 50s and also being like crazy. Like it creates, so some of the family stories that you're reading, like where does that go? Like did you, in your telling the story, did you feel like sort of becoming exceptional in some way, even if it wasn't really that exceptional? Do you know what I mean? Like it was just working and going to work. Do you think it created some of the intensity that you see 3 generations later in the family? Like the stories that your grandfather told, I'm curious about sort of like how it carries forward, especially in black families.
It had to have. My father, very egotistical man, fully embraced the stories of his exceptionalism. he, whatever opportunity he got to claim that he was, you know, head and shoulders above everybody else, he fully embraced that. And yeah, so I was raised with kind of enamored for the first black person to do X kinds of stories. And in writing the book, well, yeah, like I said, one of the tensions was kind of feeling the narrative hewing toward, right, the celebration of overcoming,
right,
and saying, you know, and trying to contextualize that. Well, yeah, but he was crazy. yeah, but he was an alcoholic. I mean, not that that's so much of a but even as it is an and.
Yeah.
And he was. And she was.
There's a lot of complexity in everyone.
And
you actually give everyone depth. Like it's not just like this
right.
person did this thing, but it's also and.
Right. It's so I'm working against the Black History Month stories, right? That flatten historical figures to one kind of. I lived my life in opposition to racial oppression, and I overcame. You did an awful lot of other things too, right? I mean, what's the rest of the story? You know, nobody's story reduces in that way. And I understand entirely why, as a culture, we need to tell the stories, right? We need to marshal. I think one of the things that fell out in the editing process was who's the guitarist who does dances like this across the stage? You know what I'm talking about? Chuck Berry. Oh. I knew somebody was gonna get it. I knew somebody was gonna get it. So there was a story about Chuck Berry driving his Cadillac onto the stage of the Fox Theater, which was the theater. And this is the theater, I think it was in Nashville or something, where he's being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's the same theater that was the first theater to refuse to, let him on stage because he was black. And so the Cadillac is in the Smithsonian, and the story that's told around the Cadillac is, Chuck Berry's overcoming racism in this moment, driving this symbol of American, materialism onto the stage of the theater. Okay, Chuck Berry was also a hardworking musician who loved what he did, right? So yeah, he overcame racism, but he also was just a really avid guitar player. And let's also celebrate the fact that he worked really hard. He worked really hard and was really good, and he loved doing what he did. Okay, yeah, and so, yeah, we need the story to be Chuck Berry worked hard to overcome racism. But Chuck Berry just played.
But then there's also, like, we need everybody else to think that we're, like, to not know about our laundry, right? Like, that's, like, also part of, I feel like, our narrative is, like, don't talk about school.
Yeah, and that's another thing that frustrated, that I was also definitely working against, is the self-flattening of, I don't make mistakes. I am an upstate. So I resented the social pressure to pretend that, so the thing that black parents tell their kids is you have to be 5-6 times better than the next person in order to be recognized in any way. That's really exhausting. And I wanted to kind of take the lit. Of course, this is after I won the Pulitzer Prize, right? I don't have to overachieve I have a little leeway.
Keep it real moment.
I
won the Pulitzer. I get to be me now.
Exactly.
That's great. Okay, so now I am going to make you read a little bit, so I can make sure that I leave some time for questions. Because it is so beautiful. I feel like it's always so nice to hear people read in their own voice, even if they have been forced into it.
Did you have a page in mind?
I mean, I'm obsessed with your dad.
Yeah. So
I would love to hear more about your dad. I mean, in particular, when you won the Pulitzer.
Oh yeah. Okay.
What page? I mean, that's maybe a little emotional.
So no. I will read.
But there's many yarns in here, so it's can't really.
Well, yeah, I can. It's 3 or 4 pages. So I'll read the introduction.
Page what?
From page is that 3. By some concoction of sugar, nicotine, prescription painkillers, rancor, and cocaine, my father, Gregory Pardlo Sr., began killing himself after my parents separated in 2007. He measured his health and lifestyle against his will to live and determined he had 10 years left in the tank. Though he did fuck up and live past 65, as he was afraid he might, he was only a year over budget. He lived his last years like a child with a handful of tokens at an arcade near closing time. Those tokens included access to credit, the patience and generosity of his family and friends, and any saleable assets, including, possibly, the titanium urn that contained his mother's ashes, mysteriously missing from the 1-bedroom Las Vegas apartment where he chose to fizzle out. These resources had to be exhausted. He didn't want to endure penury, but neither would he ever leave money on the table, as he often put it. He died without leaving a will or naming beneficiaries. My brother Robbie and I agreed to have him cremated. No medical school would have taken him, and I didn't even entertain the idea of a casket. Robbie traveled from Willingboro, New Jersey to Vegas to claim the body. My father had retired as a union representative for the American Train Dispatchers Association, but without a will, my mother had to negotiate unfamiliar bureaucracies even to claim the $2,000 grievance pay the ATDA provided to cover his funeral. My father left an assortment of defaulted mortgages, overdrawn bank accounts, and maxed out credit cards, the remaining balance on a luxury sports car he had all but totaled, and a 5-figure debt to the taxman. He died May 12, 2016, as I was working on the final drafts of this book. Writing the book gave me an excuse to talk to him. Each time I interviewed him by phone from my house in Brooklyn, I was prepared for that to have been the last time we spoke. Yet even with all my psychic and emotional preparation for his death, it was a poignant exercise to have to comb through these pages and change verb forms from present tense to past. In April 2015, days after it was announced that I'd won the Pulitzer Prize for my second book of poems, I still hadn't heard from my dad. Most of our communication was via text message, because he would get winded and need to rest after a few minutes of talking. I wanted to know if the news had reached him. He texted back, "When a Roman general conquered a town, Caesar would send a slave to ride alongside the general in the victory parade and remind the general that he was only human." The last time I saw him was in August 2015 at the party my mother threw at a hotel in Marlton, New Jersey to celebrate the prize. I was surprised he made it all the way from Las Vegas to Marlton. What a wreck he had become physically. During our rare phone conversations, he complained about the multiplying failures of his body. He couldn't walk 5 feet without losing his breath, so he'd often sit near exits where he could get out easily to have a smoke. He'd lost half his right leg to diabetes, refusing to give up the junk foods he equated with his dignity. He was incontinent. It took a Herculean effort for him to be there in both the emotional and physical senses, an effort you'd think was motivated by pride in his son's achievement. But I knew, as perhaps only a son can know, that I was the opening act. My father loved me and was indeed proud of me in his complicated way, but he came to Marlton for the crowd. He came with his motorized chair and his life-extending contraptions to give his final performance. He looked glorious, the old bull, in his matching suede jacket and pants. Determined, he ditched the chair and stood on his prosthesis, no doubt imagining himself in the mode of some hard-bitten pirate declaiming from the quarterdeck. He gave a speech that congratulated me by commemorating his own place in history, situated generationally, as he explained, between two titans, his father and me. We were the giants standing on his shoulders.
I will let everybody ask questions, but I have one last one.
Yeah.
I mean, let's imagine that your dad would have read it if he had been here. What do you think he would have thought?
Well, I can say the last, one of the last texts, because when I sold the book, I'm sure my mother told him, and again, I hadn't heard from him, and so I texted him to say, "Dad, did you hear we sold the book?" His response this time was, what's his name? The sexy black actor.
Idris Elba?
Not him, older.
Denzel.
My father's response was in text message, "Denzel Washington."
Stop.
It
took a minute. It took me a minute. He said Denzel. Oh, God. I do feel sad that I never met your dad. And on that note, I will remind everybody that the book, despite being about some very tough and complicated subject matter, is also very fun. So do we have any questions?
I can't stand it. You have us at the television studio, and it's supposed to be a 3-show thing for the intervention. And I've been through interventions with some friends, and I know that it can take much longer than 3 times, and at the end of it, they often refuse. There's nothing wrong with me. So I just want to know, did your brother accept?
It's more complicated than that, of course, right? So in the moment, yes, he did. He knows his role. He went to music school. He was in the conservatory. He performed. He was in play, theater. He knows how to. He knows when the camera is on. He knows the lines lines it's supposed to perform. That's another interesting thing about my family, right? Is we are all very conscious of, the way the story is supposed to be told, as if we're always viewing ourselves from, from a monitor. He went, and he was sober for some time, and several months later, back home, he started drinking again. A few years later, and I mentioned this in the book too, a few years later, A&E was having a "Where Are They Now?" retrospective, where they would go back and follow up on a number of the people. And they contacted us to see how Robbie was, and we were kind of like, well, he's doing okay. Yeah. We never heard from him again. We just, I think we just do it. So yeah, I don't know. Is he? And this is another question I asked. Within the story of our family. So Robbie has 2 kids. He's married and has 2 kids. He maintains a job. He's in considerable debt, but he pays most of his bills. The kids are healthy, happy. If he were and he drinks, at least a 12-pack on the weekend, if not more. If he were any other American, he watches football religiously. If he were any other American, I would not think that there was anything untoward. You probably shouldn't drink so much. But in the context of our family, it's like, what a failure. Right? She should be doing so much more. So I'm also kind of weighing that, why should he be living to my expectations? Why is that so important? Right? And who am I to decide the standards to which he should be living? And to fault him for not living to my standards. And so, of course, my mother's story is, hell yeah, you should be living to my standards. Of course, I want him to be doing what what I raised him to be doing. And, I'm not going to let him throw it all away. So, at what point is our love for someone, our expectations for someone, an expression of love, and at what point does it become a refusal to accept who they are? Right? And so that's the complication one of the many complications I'm thinking through. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your eloquence, and really a wonderful evening hearing you talk. I'm just curious, here you are in this role of being a writer, and we are at this point in our history where fewer and fewer people are reading books. And I know there are people who are reading movies. How do you deal with it in terms of your next work? Do you have ideas in terms of how you're going to get your written word out more accessible? You brought up the example that you had seen a copy of his book on the subway. I ride the subways a lot. I neither thought I must have been on the west side, but it's very seldom that I see anybody.
Anybody.
Of anyone.
Well, it's
Can
also
you repeat the first part of the question? We couldn't hear the first part of the question.
She's asking if I can synthesize the question. How do I, as a writer, contend with or address the notion that fewer people are reading, that there's a decline in just literacy or reading for pleasure, let's say, in the United States? And I will say that more people are reading on tablets, you know, so we don't necessarily see the books anymore in phones, right?
Audiobooks are the
audio.
highest rising
Yeah.
business in books, period, right now. I mean, growth. So I mean, people with earbuds in, they might be listening to a book.
So that, yeah. But yeah, so this is not, I don't think this is from a writerly perspective, I don't think this is a question that is specific to our historical moment. I think this is a question that writers have always contended with, and that is the balance of how much do I ask of a reader in terms of how do I balance the entertainment level with the come with me and think hard through these complicated issues. And much to my publisher's chagrin, I'm sure, having come from the world of poetry, I tend toward the assumption that, you know, well, there's going to be a whole world full of readers anyway, so let's just enjoy the language, and, you know, in this obscure little tricky kind of community that we have.
May I jump in?
Please
Because I have
do,
like,
please
just, I
do.
know that you're
Yeah,
not
no.
here to hear me talking about books, but, you know, one of the things that I often find myself talking about is that, you know, the narrative around books is that we're not reading. Like, it's like, you know, it's, you actually look at the numbers. We are reading. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry still. You know, and I think that sometimes we discriminate against the romance reader, and we discriminate against the genre reader, and we discriminate against the audio reader and the e-reader, and we don't think about necessarily like that bookstores are thriving. You know, there may not be as many bookstores, but you know, but you have McNally opening up a second and a third. You have Hudson Books bringing bookstores back into the airports. They're partnering with independent bookshops, LA Bay Books in Seattle. They're partnering with McNally in New York. They're partnering with, you know, I think in Nashville, Parnassus Books. So these are, you know, all of these things are happening that are indicating that people are earning dollars from selling books. And so that indicates that there are readers. I think the second piece is too, like, for me, like, right, like I grew up as a black middle class reader, right? Most of the stories that I read were like about other people that didn't look like me, or they were people that looked like me, that lived lives that were completely different. So if you take a huge, enormous segment of the population, and you say you don't exist in literature, right? Like there is no, you are a monolith, you are one thing. We may only have books about this one thing. And that's like, you could put that anywhere. You could talk about people in Kansas, you can talk about black books, you can talk about Latino books, you can talk about anyone, right? Like if those stories don't exist. But it's like when I think about books like Pachinko, which Min Jin Lee recently published, or 2 years ago, you know, like I feel like every Korean person that I know has read Pachinko, right? You know, it's like every single black person I know has read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. You know, these are books that are capturing the imagination, and I think that the more that we continue to publish that way, and then beyond just publishing it, the more that we have marketing teams and sales reps that know how to sell your book, right? Like at Knopf, at Riverhead, and all of these like sort of prestige houses that have been, you know, selling literature for years and years. I think the more that we'll continue to build up not only an audience, but a new audience. And I think that together with the fact that we are really selling books, but because we're not selling books, and publishers have been bummed out about not selling books. Publishers are screaming, the business is dying, we're laying people off, and so we're screaming, you know, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. The sky has not actually fallen, and that ricochets out. It's like, you don't want to buy what I'm selling, which is a horrible way to sell things. And so, you know, it naturally depresses what we're doing. So anyway, this is like what I think about all the time. So I just think people are reading. I think like you're saying it must have been on the West Side, but it's like I live in Williamsburg, and there's like everybody's really, you know, like super into books right now. It's like I see, you know, people reading translated literature and black literature and, you know, like old literature and new stuff, and conversations are happening on my Twitter feed. I mean, to be fair, my Twitter feed is pretty well curated for readers, but like, you know, but it's like, but I'm feeling like I'll have a job in 10 years if I want it, you know?
We'll still be here.
Yeah, you know, so it's like I feel like they're, you know, books are, it's like a prime, it's one of our prime storytelling formats. You know, the day that people stop being interested in films that are developed out of the stories that books are telling, that is the day that I will be like really concerned about like whether or not like storytelling will exist, you know?
Yes,
I have a question.
So sorry, what
As an author, obviously you want to sell what you want to read it and absorb it. Do you have a preference, personal preference for how people absorb and experience your books, whether it be audible or on a tablet or on a written page?
I'm still very new to the world of commercial publishing, right? So, like I said, coming from the world of poetry, all I've ever known is that slim volume of poems, and that has always been, you know, as we trading baseball cards, you know,
Well,
you have
particularly
this.
in poetry, I would think it would be a very, I don't read poetry, I don't know much about it, it would be a very different experience to listen to a poet than to read a poet.
But although audiobooks, more and more poets are recording their poems now too.
Well, they're later to carry for a start, aren't they?
Well, yeah.
I mean, it's huge, of course, unfortunately.
Exactly, yeah. So my point was, like, coming to this format, this is just as new to me as the audiobook is new to me. I recorded the audiobook for Air Traffic. And so, you know, as far as I was concerned, it was just something everybody did. And, you know,
And you did it rather than get an actor to do it.
yeah, so the publisher prefers that the author read, because the author knows the cadences and, right, and punchlines and everything.
Except lots of authors are awful at it, and so.
And they have to get an actor, right? Yeah, or actors, yeah. But when it works out, I think they prefer that to have the author. So I did the audiobook. I'm not sure if there's the ebook isn't out yet. I don't think it's.
But not
Is
sure.
it?
I'm positive.
Is it? Okay.
Now, it's pretty good, yeah?
But
Not yet. Not yet.
if you were asked, if I said, or somebody who said they wanted to experience your book, I'm using the word experience rather than.
Yeah.
How would you prefer that they do it?
I would prefer like they cart the book out. I'm perfectly happy with the.
I saw that galley and was like,
yeah, sir.
Sounds like you, had an interesting editing process, a little different from the poetry side. How would you describe that process overall as an author?
So my editor at Knopf was for this book a very young, brilliant young woman who translated Russian poetry, and so she and I had these amazing conversations. But she wasn't terribly interested in rewriting any of the work. So most of what her editing was sort of culling through all of the excess, you know, verbiage that I had in the work. My agent, however, before selling the book, he and I had these really kind of robust conversations about tone and the direction of the story. But I enjoyed those, but I think there are different levels of engagement, points of engagement in the editing process. So these kind of abstract questions came with the agent, and then a more kind of technical approach came with the editor. That was all very different from any of the conversations I had with my first poetry book, I sent it in, and Brenda Hillman, who was the judge, the work that she did was just to kind of rearrange the poems. So she wanted the book organized in a particular way. When it came to digest, the editorial, I mean, it was very much, did you mean this comma to be here? You changed the spelling of this word, is that intentional? right? So really kind of all more mechanical even than my editor, Knop. So yeah, I guess there was more of a production team, there was more of a production process with this book than with either of the poetry collections.
My question is this, and this,
I think this is our last one.
Yeah.
Last two.
I was just gonna ask you what's next for you. Are you going back to poetry, or are you gonna stick with prose for a while?
So I have a couple of projects. I do have a poetry project. So my grandfather Bob, who I was telling you about, when he retired, he was also an entrepreneur, and when he retired, he bought a little bar in South Jersey and turned it into a jazz club. And as a young man, I ran a jazz club, and that's incidentally where I learned to drink. And so throughout my 20s, I was the manager of this jazz club in South Jersey, and I want to write about that. And that's going to be the next prose project. And so I'm interested in jazz clubs. I want to travel around the country and visit jazz clubs and go to and talk to people in cities. So, for example, there was a jazz club in Houston that's no longer there that was really kind of famous. So I just want to interview people and about, find out about the club and its impact on the community. So that's the next prose project. The poetry project, there's obviously a lot of conversation about the endangered African American male, right? The violence against African American males, that institutional violence and the blue violence. And one thing that strikes me is that very often the rationalization for that violence is I felt my life was threatened. I was mortally frightened. Darren Wilson said very famously, I saw a monster coming at me. Right? I had to shoot him because he was a monster. And so I'm thinking about the terror that transforms people into monsters. And it reminds me of the witch trials. Right? And so I'm looking at witches and how there's an entire legal structure created to prosecute, to identify women who were possessed and prosecute them and then punish them. Right? There was an entire rational structure built up around this, and then like the light at the end of that tunnel, the one piece of optimism that I'm holding out is that at some point we just said, maybe we stop killing women. Maybe it's not such a good idea. Maybe we should stop doing that. So my hope is that in the process of writing the poems, I can get to a point where I can think about it, or at least have my readers imagine the possibility, maybe we stop shooting black guys.
And this is the part where I'd like to give you the National Award for Poetry in advance. I don't judge, that wasn't one.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you very much.